You talk about kind of the disconnected, unaccountable benevolence of the Aga Khan, and I wanted to ask you to end the latest fighting. I know that some of the people fighting laid down their arms at the request of the Aga Khan. Was the Aga Khan crucial to ending the latest round of fighting, and would it have ended without his involvement?
I'm sure the Aga Khan did, in fact, encourage fighters to lay down their arms, and that too for the best of reasons, obviously because he wants to avoid bloodshed. Whether or not the people who did lay down their arms did so entirely because of this request is another question altogether. However, I think what's important and interesting is the demonstration that the recourse to arms seems to have been the only serious obstacle in the way of the government's attempt to establish complete control over the region. And I don't think that lesson has been lost on anyone there, not least organizations such as AKDN.
What's your view of who was doing the fighting against government forces?
It seems to me that there was at least some elements of a popular resistance. I don't think these old opposition fighters and their men and their henchmen could really have held off, what now meant to be nearly 3,000 government troops there. And it seems to me clear that ordinary people actually participated in blocking roads. Ordinary people, organized themselves into local councils to deal with various non-military issues, such as, how do you secure food and water supplies? How do you make sure people have medical attention? Et cetera, et cetera. And this seems to be very, very interesting and encouraging.
It's interesting, actually, you talk about food and water supplies, because this, as you note in your article, these are things that just after the Civil War, the Aga Khan network was incredibly crucial in providing healthcare, water, food, things like that. And now there's kind of the rise of this possibly domestic kind of civil society. Do you think, one, if the network were gone, if the Aga Khan's influence were gone, which I assume that you think is pretty unlikely, would people's lives there get worse?
Yes, I think there's no question they would get worse, because the Aga Khan Development Network plays a very important and beneficial role in the region, and has done so, has almost certainly saved many, possibly even thousands of lives since it came into the area in the late 90s. So, I would by no means recommend that it should simply disappear. That's not the point. I think the important point is that everyone seems to have been living in a kind of world of illusions. There seems to have been there seems to have been a feeling that when you have this particular form of global civil society present in this area, it can just run things or allow things to run in a depoliticized way. And I think it's that illusion that has come crashing down with the latest violence in Gorno-Badakhshan, because it seems clear to me, and has always seemed clear to me, even at the time when I was working there, that no state is going to tolerate this kind of situation continuing. The state led by President Rahman has taken care of, in rather thuggish ways, all kinds of other challenges to it in different parts of the country, and now seems to be intent on regaining control over Gorno-Badakhshan. I mean, the AKDN, when it came in, was of course seen as a great savior and as a very important and moneyed organization, but that's no longer the case. Tajikistan has become part of global geopolitics in the meantime. So there are all kinds of other global movements and actors around. The Tajik government itself has recourse to some of them. It no longer needs the AKDN in a way that it might have in the past. So the AKDN's presence or absence in a way is it's important locally, but it should also be seen in the larger context of the entry of global movements and organizations into the region. It should not be abstracted from these other things.
Do you think that the civil society is strong enough to occupy that political space? Is there enough fear of civil war on both sides?
I don't know. I think obviously there is fear, at least on one side, if not on the other. But what I think was the opportunity that was lost when the AKDN came in. Basically, it came in and it had an interregnum. Right? Before the state could turn its attentions again to Badakhshan. There was a certain interregnum there where the AKDN more or less ran things. During that period, it would have been very nice to see the establishment of local democratic practices and institutions, instead of everyone being all talent being sucked into the NGO sector and leaving the sort of political sector to either non-entities or to sort of corrupt actors, etc., or government appointees. It would have been, I think, a very helpful and indeed crucial thing for Gorno-Badakhshan to have given rise to its own local politics. At the end of the day, civil society cannot really exist without political society. It's not there to replace politics. And I think that was one of the things that was happening during this interregnum created by the end of the Civil War and the presence of the AKDN there. If you look, for instance, internationally, even if you look at the Arab Spring, here you have both the sight of the power of civil society to topple governments, right? And yet at the same time, their inability to create another kind of politics, to produce a politics of their own.
I mean, there's nothing really like the Aga Khan.
No, you're right. I mean, it's so fascinating because, as I said in my piece, it seemed to me anyway to be one of the first examples of this kind of organization going in immediately after the Civil War and creating peace, ensuring the survival of many people, allowing others opportunity of employment, of education, etc., etc. It was an extraordinary event or set of events. And I don't by any means want to undermine that history. What worries me is how the very success of the AKDN has resulted in new kinds of problems that it was unable or perhaps unwilling to address. And one of these problems was the presence of this illusion or delusion that a civil society movement or set of organizations can actually stave off the political realm and run the show. It's just not going to happen. It's a very cautious organization, and it's cautious for a reason, because its aim is to protect its people and the people with whom it works. I think that, the intentions, I don't have any doubt of the intentions of the AKDN and those who run it. And I think this is how they, in fact, operate. They operate behind the scenes, operate fairly secretively. They come to various kinds of understanding. And the reason they do that is, I think at least one of, say, two reasons. One reason is historical, which is where the Aga Khan and his community of Ismailis, which are in most parts of the world minority groups. They don't even have regional majorities like they do in Tajikistan and in northern Pakistan, for instance. This has been the modus operandi for the Aga Khan's organizations in other parts of the world, where Ismailis tend to be either they're religious minorities, they don't have any territory that they might call their own, and they tend to belong only to certain sectors of society, say they're traders. And so that works very well for them, but it doesn't work so well, I think, where majority populations in their local regions happen to all be Ismaili, where they don't, in fact, have all the same kinds of interests, because they don't only belong to, say, groups of businessmen. They include everyone from the man who sweeps the street to the governor of the place. You can't just, glom all these people together into a single interest group. That's one thing. I think the other thing, of course, is that because they don't operate by, how should I put it, nor should they, I suppose, operate democratically. They are not voted in, they can't presume to mobilize people in any other way. So they have to simply represent them in this fashion by behind the scenes kinds of negotiations, and then simply present a fait accompli to people.
As crucial as that organization has been to kind of ensuring the peace and deferring more war or something like that, it's also somewhat of a minor player, especially, it almost marginalized it itself, right, in the next 2 years. When it's just a free-for-all on that border, and whoever controls that border controls millions and millions of dollars.
Yes, I mean, I think that, and that's why I think it's so important to see all of these things, as part of a single package. As I said earlier, it's clear that you can't put Humpty Dumpty back together again. You can't suddenly say, "Look, we're going to get rid of all these global actors and these global processes, etc., and just draw a ring around Tajikistan and it'll do its own local thing." No, that's not going to happen. Nor perhaps should it happen. But what you can, I think, move towards is preventing the complete fragmentation of a local or national politics within a set of global processes, which might end up in encouraging this kind of free for all that you were describing. If you think about the institutional memory of the AKDN and indeed of many of the individuals in it, you can imagine them thinking, "Look, we have seen this before. We have seen this in Uganda, when all the Asians were kicked out by Idi Amin, the dictator of the time, and the Aga Khan had to work very hard, charter aircraft, send them in to rescue not only his own Ismailis but many of the other Indians who were being kicked out at 72 hours notice. This has happened time and again in the Congo, in Kinshasa. This has happened, in moments of great violence like in Gujarat in India. So there is an institutional and indeed lived history, which is not a Tajik history. People in Badakhshan probably don't know about any of this stuff. So there is a way in which the kind of the globalization of the Aga Khan's institutions allows them to compare apples and oranges, but they might not be appropriate comparisons, as you suggest. So maybe this incursion into the Pamirs had to do as much with the lucrative drugs trade and sort of internecine quarrels over who controls the profits of that trade, as it had to do with the government trying to reestablish control over the region, which I think is probably a very serious motive as well. But there's more than one thing going on, and these, even put together, these motives don't necessarily compare to, say, what happened in Kampala. Yet, this is the way in which the international or global dimension of the organization works against its local politics, because everything gets slotted into a pre-existing framework. And so you might say either it's a return of the civil war, which is what people locally might think, or this is yet another attack on a religious minority. But of course, this only makes sense once this community has already been constructed as a religious minority. When a population like the Pamiris in Gorno-Badakhshan come to be seen somehow as wards of this global or international organization, and therefore as a religious minority, part of a globally dispersed religious minority, the risk that is being run is one of denationalization. In other words, they might be seen more as one bit of a globally dispersed religious minority than as a crucial and integral part of the nation state of Tajikistan.